Dr. David Starkey, good afternoon.
Hello.
How are you?
I am well.
I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
That's all right.
Dr. David Starkey. Some interesting news about at the moment, isn't there? Have you followed any of that Abu Qatada case? Does it interest you at all?
Yeah. I think the whole European Court of Human Rights is an absurdity. The convention was never intended to apply to individual citizens. It was originally devised after the war to keep governments in line. The European Convention does not work as a legal document for individuals. It's not written as such. It's deliberately on the one hand this and on the other hand that, and when you apply it to individuals you get the kind of chaos that we've seen now. The court was not allowed to deal with individual cases until very, very recently. It's a classic example of European institutions constantly aggregating power to themselves, accumulating power.
What was it doing before it was able to deal with individual cases?
It just dealt with governments. It was intended to deal with governments.
And did you have a problem with that? Was that all right as a principle?
I think, in fact, the whole principle of universal human rights is an absurdity. Rights are conditioned by individual cultures and by individual periods. I mean, you've only got to think of what we think of as universal human rights. You know, I'm gay. Generally speaking, we assume that people have a right to do that now. That was unthinkable in this country less than 20 years ago. In other words, universal human rights don't exist at all. They're conditioned by culture, they're conditioned by history, they're conditioned by geography.
So should they be written into British law?
What, the universal? No,
yeah,
it's absurd. Sorry, look, Richard, look at what the convention says. For example, on freedom of speech. If you look at the amendment to the American Constitution, it's an absolutely the First Amendment, it's absolutely straightforward statement that there is a right to freedom of speech. If you look at the European Declaration, what it says, there's a right to freedom of speech subject to considerations of public health, public law, religion, decency, God only knows what. In other words, this is a law that is unknowable. This is why the government is having the problems that it is, because it's drafted in such an open-ended way, it's perpetually judge-made law, and that's a very bad thing.
To flip that around, is it not too simplistic in the First Amendment to say everyone's entitled to free speech, when the reality is people aren't entitled to complete free speech? If you slander someone publicly, you'll get in trouble. The reality is more complex than the First Amendment would have you believe.
Sorry, no, it's not. The First Amendment is brilliant, like the whole of the American Constitution. It's a masterpiece of good English legal drafting. The issues that arise from free speech are not problems of free speech, they're problems of incitement. You know, the famous American Supreme Court ruling is that you've got a right to say anything you like, but you mustn't say fire in a theatre, because that will lead to action. And the confusion we've got ourselves into is mistaking words for action. But Richard, yeah. I am here not to have this idle conversation. I'm here to talk about an important forthcoming exhibition. May we go on to that now?
Yes, we may. Yes, we may. I want to talk about it.
Good. So do I.
It's a fascinating topic. So this is, you're creating an exhibition, the National Maritime Museum, which is about the relationship between the Thames and the royal family.
It's the Thames and ceremony. It's broader than the royal family, but it's looking at the river as this great processional way, because, Richard, of course, we go right back to the 15th century. Medieval London, the Thames is the great street of the city. If you look at, I know you're up in Salford, God help you, but if you remember what London looks like, the streets of London are actually very narrow, and they were even narrower in the Middle Ages. So there was only one grand street that you could use for processions, and it was the river. And of course, using the river enables you to do all sorts of wonderful things. You can have boats that sort of firing guns. You can have pageants, and you can have hundreds of thousands of people, tens and tens of thousands of people lining the river watching. And we hope there'll be millions watching.
I hope so. I find all this exciting. By the way, I feel as though I want to just step in on behalf of the people of Salford. Do you not like Salford?
My family comes from Oldham and Rochdale. I'm sure I know the area much better than you do.
Now, so this pageant is in June, I believe, isn't it? They said 1,000 boats, maybe 20,000 individuals involved in it. So there's a rich history stretching back a long way. Sometimes I wonder whether or not we use the River Thames enough. When I walk alongside the Thames, it's not as if there is masses of traffic on there. It's not as if we have these pageants very much anymore. Do you think the river is used properly at the moment?
I think the river it's very difficult. Again, when we go back into those centuries, the river looked very different Richard, in those days. The river that we've got now, like so many things in London, is a creation of the great Victorians. It's a creation of the 19th century. In earlier centuries, the river was twice as wide as it was now. It was this great sluggish stream that flowed on its natural course. All the great buildings of London came down to the river. They had water gates, they had landing stages. The principal way you got around was ceremonial barges.
It was more like Venice.
It looked just like Venice. And the star of the exhibition is this wonderful painting by the greatest Venetian painter, Canaletto, of the Lord Mayor's Day procession, because that was on the river too, of 1748 to 1749. And it looks just like Venice, but better, because you've got St. Paul's in the background, and St. Paul's, knocks spots off St. Mark's.
By the way, does it really?
I don't. This is a matter of taste.
Of course it is. The Canaletto painting...
A bit like the Human Declaration.
I don't think that Canaletto painting has been in London before. I guess when it was painted, but since then it's been in Prague, hasn't it?
It's been in Prague. It's been in the Lobkowicz collection in Prague, which is one of the great European princely collections. It was confiscated under the communists, and it's now gone back to the Lobkowicz heir. And indeed, this is the first time since that painting went to Prague in 1752 that it's come back to London, where it was painted, and where Canaletto actually lived for a period of time, having affairs with the wife of the Venetian ambassador and being generally cosseted and coddled by the English aristocracy. There are wonderful stories in this exhibition too, Richard. I mean, one of my favourites is the greatest of these river processions, the Aqua Triumphalis, the triumphal waterway of 1662 to celebrate the marriage of Catherine of Braganza to Charles II. You have this very, very splendid river procession, but we've also got a kind of secret report. It's a bit, like a Sun reporter, tapping somebody's what would you call it, voicemail, because it's a report by Pepys, the great diarist, writing in code and all the rest of it. And he sort of says, basically, the procession was rubbish. I couldn't see a thing. I couldn't even see the king and queen. He sees two pageants, which he misdescribes, but he says, it was absolutely wonderful. Right next to me was the king's mistress, Barbara Villas, and she's scrumptious. And so you have this man's reactions to the royal mistress when the whole thing is supposedly honouring the queen. It's, it's a bit as though Camilla had been desirable. It's completely fantastic. And we don't illustrate that perhaps as directly as we should have done.
Do you just by the way, I'm interested. So the 1662 procession, what would it have been made up of? What would it have looked like?
He said that when he described it and he saw it from the Whitehall stairs, the front of the palace, he said there were 10, you said 1,000 boats for this procession. He said there were 10,000. The river, this huge, wide, sluggish river, was actually covered. You couldn't see water. But the thing that we would have noticed about it would have been not only the stately barges, the ones, in fact, the National Maritime, one of the things we're showing, the gems of the permanent collection of the museum is a state barge of Frederick, Prince of Wales, from the 1740s.
And is that perfectly intact?
Completely intact, designed by William Kent, last used actually by Victoria and Albert. It was the royal barge until then, and it's a symphony of gilding and carving and of crimson. But it's not only, if you look at and we have a complete account of Aqua Triumphalis, it's not only that you have barges like that, you have these great, I think they must have been commercial barges in our sense of the word, that have been turned into pageants and by all of the city livery companies and all sorts of people. And you have the most amazing sights. One of them is complete, with two camels, two Moors, sounding cannon, mountains surmounted by virgins. Absolutely amazing. They're the equivalent of a float, but on a huge scale and hugely elaborate. And incidentally, when there is the forthcoming procession for the Queen's Jubilee, the organisers of it in some ways are doing even better. They're not just having barges of musicians and fireworks and whatever. They've actually got a complete carillon from a city church that is going to go up the river with the bells pealing as all the bells of the city churches on either bank answer it. My fear is, of course, that when you get the great bass bell swinging away, the whole thing will topple over and go straight into the Thames, but I'm sure that won't happen. We've thought of that.
Dr. David Starkey, please do stay there for us. I want to talk to you more about this.
Of course.
And frost, it's the frost fairs I was reading about earlier. Let's do that in a minute. This is when it would freeze over during what was called, I think, the mini ice age, wasn't it?
That's right.
And there'd be 11 inches thick of ice.
Because climate change then, just as climate change is now.
Another thorny issue we may or may not come on to. But it's essentially there were festivals on the Thames itself. 85058 bacon at bbc.co.uk. Your questions and comments to Dr. David Starkey, Olivia Newton-John and the moaning on the way. It is 2:35. Here's Rachel Hodges.
Online at bbc.co.uk.
Fantastic spectacle.
William, thank you very much. Lots of you are texting in relation to whether or not people are born evil. I've not read those out, but I will make room to read some out later. We're at 85058. Olivia Newton-John on the way. It's 20 to 3. Dr. David Starkey is with me. He's curating an exhibition on the relationship between the Thames and pageantry at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Dr. Starkey.
I'm called David.
David. Here's a text.
I can't call you Mr. Bacon.
I don't mind the formality at all. But Mr. Mark Davis here says on the text, can you ask David if he still thinks the monarchy is relevant today, and if so, why?
Relevant is a word that I don't use very often. I think it's constitutional monarchy, such as we have, is easily the best form of government. We were talking about Norway. Norway is a constitutional monarchy and is an admirably run country. You've been hearing about that. Sweden is a constitutional monarchy and is an admirably run country. Denmark is a constitutional monarchy and is an admirably run country. So is the Netherlands. And so, interestingly enough, is Spain, where constitutional monarchy was the essential device that enabled you to shift from fascism to a modern democracy. We're immensely lucky, because you see, the problem is, if you get rid of monarchy, you have the problem that the poor old French did. You have a revolution which produces a bitterly divided politics between extreme right and extreme left. What we have in this country, Richard, is the very best of all possible worlds. We have all the rights of a republic. We, in fact, as we were talking about with the European Declaration on Human Rights, actually being an attempt to get everybody else to enjoy what we did long, long before they did. We have republican rights. All this business of debating subject and citizen is a load of old baloney. But at the same time, we preserved with the monarchy a sense of historical continuity, so there isn't this rupture, there isn't this extremism, and I think that's a very, very good thing.
On that extremism point, so there's less division between extreme right and extreme right and extreme left. Because I guess you see that in America, don't you, as well, if you look at the Republicans and the Democrats. So do you mean that the politics of Britain and Norway and Sweden and Denmark and the Netherlands are just generally a bit more centre ground?
They're much more centre ground. You look at, for example, you look at the election in France, you look at not simply the election in France, it's not simply the contrast between Sarkozy and Hollande, it's above all, you look at what the National Front in France is going to get. They're going to get probably 15, 18, figures that BNP, thank God, could only dream of. That is what you get with a revolution. That's what happened in Spain. When you get dramatically rapid change from a traditional society and forced modernization, lots of people become very defensive and they go over to fascism or something like it. And on the other hand, of course, the proponents of revolution go over to the extreme left. We've been unbelievably lucky. The last time we had that was the 17th century, and thank God we got over it.
Do you not see America as a really well-run country then?
America is interesting. I mean, the real problem with America was exactly getting rid of the monarchy. The problem with the American presidency is that it tries to be both a prime minister and a monarch. That's the difficulty that Obama has all the time. Is he above the political fray? Is he a representative of the nation and of everybody? Or is he just the leader of the Democrats, And it produces something very, very uneasy. The same is true of Sarkozy in France. You can't be, as the Queen can be, a genuine national symbol. You can't be because you're rooted in one political side or another political side.
Let's come back to the exhibition. David Starkey, which is at the National Maritime Museum. Has it started already?
No, it hasn't. The Queen herself will open it next Wednesday on the 25th. And, Richard, it's rather wonderful. She will be coming back to where she was as a little girl 75 years ago when her father and mother opened the National Maritime Museum. And one of the things we have in the catalogue and the exhibition is this wonderful photograph showing this very self-confident little girl striding beside her mother through the colonnade of the National Maritime Museum, where she will be again on Wednesday. And then there's yet more sort of celebrations, and it's open to the general public on Friday the 27th.
What a great museum the National Maritime Museum is as well, isn't it?
It's wonderful. It's the whole of Greenwich, the old Royal Naval Hospital and the museum. I say it is the most noble coming together of land, landscape, water and architecture in Europe. It is staggering. People go on about St. Petersburg or they go on about Paris, but right on our doorstep, not of course in Salford, but right on our doorstep down here, you've got this wonderful, wonderful assemblage of buildings, Wren's triumph.
And you're often described as a Tudor historian, and that part of London has played a big part, hasn't it, in the Tudor dynasties and in Tudor
very
life.
Definitely. Greenwich, this is long, long before the present buildings were built. It was the favourite palace of the Tudors. It's where Henry VIII is born, which is why you're asking me about, curators and guest curators and why I'm involved with the National Maritime. I was first involved with them way back in 1991 when they put on a show for the 500th anniversary of Henry's birth. Henry VIII is born there. Elizabeth I, the first Queen Elizabeth, is born there as well in 1536. And to mark the anniversary of her death in 2003, I curated another exhibition there. So this is another one for Elizabeth II. It's become a bad habit, but a bit like appearing on your show. But
it's a bad habit. I'd like you to continue.
You were going to talk about Frost Fair.
Yes, well,
come on, presenter. Yes.
Well, actually, I was going to tie it into Henry VIII because I was reading. So a Frost Fair was when there was this sort of mini ice age for, I think, 300 years or so. In the winters, the Thames would often freeze over 11 inches thick of ice, and there'd be essentially a festival on the river itself. People could walk across the river.
A beer fest, a kind of beer fest.
And I think apparently Henry VIII would sled from central London to Greenwich. Along the Thames.
It's certainly frozen. I think he once rides. I don't actually know there is any significant use of sleighs, actually, in the 16th century in England. They were heavily used on the continent. I mean, the really interesting question is why this happens. You're right. There were colder winters. Not always. Pepys, in his diary, describes one January in which there were butterflies and roses. So, the climate shifts around. The reason the river freezes isn't only that it's generally speaking, colder than we get now, it's because the river is shallow. It's this very shallow, meandering river, not enclosed between the banks, the embankments that we have now. And also, it's because of London Bridge. The arches of London Bridge, the old London Bridge, the medieval bridge with the houses and the heads of traitors over the gate and all the rest of it, the arches are very narrow. So it actually blocks the tidal flow of the river.
Like a dam.
It's exactly like a dam. And it means the flow of the river is actually much less than it is now, which again, it makes freezing much easier.
The Queen is opening this exhibition at the National Maritime Museum shortly. And am I right in thinking that in the past you've called her boring?
No, I didn't call her boring. I said, which is certainly true, that the Queen, if she'd been given the choice, she would have liked to have been a farmer's wife. She'd have liked to have been a housewife. She is not one of them.
How do you know that?
I think you don't conventionally describe conversations with royalty.
But you're not a prime minister. You can do that.
She has. Well, it's good manners, and occasionally I am guilty of good manners. Not very often, but occasionally I am guilty of good manners, even on Radio 5. She said so frequently. She and Prince Philip love that sort of life. She is not an intellectual, though she is not unintelligent. She is not interested in the arts. Oddly enough, she's not even very interested in the history of the monarchy. I must be one of the very few people who've read every Christmas broadcast, which is the only time, with the conventions of constitutional monarchy, that she's allowed to say what she wants to say. There is a single reference to any monarch before her grandfather, before George V, and it is indeed to Queen Elizabeth I, and this is what she says about the very greatest of her predecessors. I won't do her voice, it's too rude. I am frequently compared to my great predecessor, Queen Elizabeth I. I do not see the point of this comparison. Queen Elizabeth I was unmarried, had no children, and never travelled abroad. That's her interest in history. So but you know what? The reason that none of this really matters is that she has done an extraordinary job of a non-job. She has simply been a symbol of absolute continuity when everything else has been falling to bits around her.
But she hasn't really done anything.
But not doing things, you know, sometimes, Richard, is very important. It's what's being called a symbol. And she's been an extraordinarily effective symbol of continuity. There's a wonderful phrase in Gilbert and Sullivan in the operetta Iolanthe on the role of the House of Lords. And the refrain of it is, the House of Lords throughout those years did nothing in particular, but did it very well. And the Queen has done it very well.
Now, I must ask you about this because we're getting so many texts about it, and we have to respond to the texts that come in. And people are talking about the comments that you made on Newsnight in relation to last summer's riots and who was to blame. Do you have any regrets about what you said?
No, none whatever. I said what is self-evidently true, and what I have regrets about is the way it was dramatised by some of the people who appeared with me on that show, which I thought was disgraceful. We were talking about freedom of speech beforehand. All human progress, Richard, depends on the little boy, and in many ways, I act as a little boy in public life who says, look, the emperor is not wearing any clothes. And we really must face that. And if we're to declare whole areas of our society, like race relations, off limits, we will make no progress. I am not a racist. I desperately want our citizens of all colours to be part of a common community that is British, but may remember, if Scotland becomes independent, which I think is more than 50-50, will have to become English. We've got to devise a sense of English nationhood in which all citizens, whatever their origins, whatever their colour, whatever their religion, can participate equally. Interestingly enough, that's exactly what Boris Johnson said when Ken Livingstone said to him, you know, you haven't mentioned, just one second, you haven't mentioned the black community. He said, I've mentioned everybody. The problem with multiculturalism is that it separates us. It sets black against white. It sets black against brown. It sets gay against straight. And this, I think, is dreadful. It's exactly, come on, somebody who's unimpeachably good and virtuous and left-wing, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that's exactly what he said about the culture of rights and entitlement. It works against a notion of the common good. That is quite enough. Can we go back to the exhibition?
No, I know, because I just want to ask you about this, because there are so many texts about it. Let's just examine exactly what you said for a moment, where you appeared to blame the riots on a black gangster culture. That was one of the comments that you made. And then, you know, we had this report into the riots from the Riots, Communities and Victims panel, and the chairman of that panel said the cause of the riots were complex and no single group was responsible. And of course, he said a lot more than that. But do you not think that perhaps your identification, your conclusions as to the causes of the riots were just in the end a bit too simplistic, a bit too narrow?
No, what I was trying to do was to highlight what was a central cause, which, interestingly enough, the commission that you refer to and the utterly preposterous report from LSE and The Guardian never actually looked at. Look, Richard, the riots began in the absolute classic way, as I pointed out, of an American race riot. A black is killed by the police, his family protest, riot and mayhem starts. And none of the reports have actually taken that fact and looked at it seriously. This is desperately dangerous. As I also pointed out, we've got to ask if general causes like unemployment, lack of youth opportunities, the terrible unemployment figures, which are particularly bad for young blacks and young people in general, that you just mentioned on the news now. These are terrible figures. But remember, areas of much worse unemployment than, say, Ealing did not riot. They really did not riot. So, in other words, if you look at the geography of the riot, Scotland didn't riot. Yorkshire didn't riot. In other words, there are very big questions. Now, let me just take this back, Richard, to what you're asking me about the monarchy. I think we've got a terrible identity vacuum in England at the moment, and particularly in southern and Midland England. I think one of the reasons why immigration in many ways has been digested better in the northeast and in Scotland is that in Scotland, an Asian, and Scotland has got a large Asian population, but a very low black one, an Asian in Scotland will identify as Scottish. In other words, there's a sense of common identity. What's happened in England is we've lost a sense of common identity, and the result of that are the horrors of the ghettos and the horrors of riot.
Well, a common English identity is now associated with the far right, isn't it?
That's right. But why? This is a ludicrous notion. Why is it all right to have a common Scots identity but not to have a common English identity?
When you were...
sorry, Richard, forgive me. I'm asking you a question. Why do we automatically assume that it's far right to be English? I'm not. Sorry, no.
No. I'm saying I'm not saying it's all right. It's not for me to answer questions. I'm a BBC presenter. I can't express opinions. I'm just saying there is an association.
And it's an association which has been sedulously fostered by people on the left. It's outrageous. Why is it right wing to say you're proud of being English? The history of England is one of the noblest of any country. It's got terrible episodes and disgraceful episodes, but all those freedoms that we were talking about in the European Convention on Human Rights are let me finish. They are first pioneered here in England. And Parliament is an English institution. Common law is an English institution. The notion of responsible government is English. Sorry, can we just keep on? Those are nothing to be ashamed of. They're things to be profoundly proud of.
I'm going to play you a clip here, David Starkey. Which was a comment made in response to what you said on Newsnight. A lot of people found it offensive.
So, Richard,
a lot of people said it was...
I am cutting this short. I am not here to talk about this. I've said enough about it. You said enough about it. Either we talk about the exhibition, which is the future, or we curtail this conversation. Clear?
Okay, yes. Okay, all right, I'm clear. But you can understand that I ask these questions in response to what people are texting in, and it's what the audience are reacting to. But... the exhibition is at the National Maritime Museum, David Starkey. It is curated by you. It is about the relationship between the Thames and pageantry, looking ahead to this big pageant that will take place in June. It's presumably, you mentioned the royal barge earlier, a new royal barge has been commissioned, has it, for the forthcoming pageant?
Yes, there will be. It's not a real royal barge in the sense that it won't be a regular mode of transport. It's been, I think, paid for by a group of businessmen. It's intended largely for use of charity. It's modelled on those great barges that you see in the Canaletto, or in the, or indeed in the museum with the Prince Frederick barge. I heard, but again I really don't know whether this is true, that Prince Charles will be in it. The Queen will not. The Queen, I suppose on grounds of her age and security, is travelling on a nice, comfortable, regular riverboat that'll be decked out for the occasion with gold and crimson, and which rejoices in the wonderful name of the spirit of Chartwell. So Winston Churchill, of course, who had another very great pageant for his funeral, his spirit will ride again, as Chartwell, of course, is Churchill's house.
Dr. David Starkey, thank you. Always engaging.
A pleasure.
Thank you very much. Let's get some travel. Look at that. Look at that ornament. We've got you waiting 12 minutes.